Metal Arm's Glitch in the System is a third-person shooter from 2003. This is a video about Demon Souls. Metal Arms was made by an incredibly passionate team at Swinging Ape Studios, which started out as just 7 people desperately trying to keep the lights on for one more month while pitching their idea to publishers at E3 2001. Eventually, Sierra purchased the publishing rights after then CEO Mike Ryder personally championed the game after getting to play the demo. Playing this game as a kid, and now replaying it again in preparation for the video, I can see why. Metal Arms is just chock full of charm, from the surprisingly great voice cast.
Hey, as I can see, still no mutt and no chip.
I was on Flax's chassis the whole way here. He didn't come through here.
You'll never catch me, you rock cookie clanger!
To the incredibly unique gameplay elements, it's a ton of fun, with some stuff I've never seen in any other game since, like fully destructible robotic enemies, where shooting off their arm can lead them to wildly firing to their own comrades, or trying to throw a grenade and instead simply dropping it at their feet. Or the possession mechanic, where if you sneak up behind any enemy in the game, you can take control of them, getting to use all of their unique abilities like flying or stomping to send a shockwave through nearby bots. All this meant that 2 years later, Metal Arms became the parent company Vivendi's most anticipated game release according to an attendee survey at E3 2003. With overall positive critical reception and a nomination for Action Game of the Year at the DICE Awards, it seems like the opposite story of what this video is truly about. The 2009 PS3 title, Demon Souls. From Software was already an established company at the time they made Demon Souls, finding previous success with the niche but frugally produced Kingsfield series of first-person dungeon crawlers, and the mecha action series Armored Core. In 2006, pre-release hype for a different series of fantasy RPGs was hitting its peak with the upcoming release of The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Seeing the high levels of excitement, but also the Xbox exclusivity, Sony decided that they too wanted Oblivion, and approached From Software to develop it. It was a weird choice, as while Kingsfield had a cult following, they never really found any popularity outside of Japan, and had only seen financial success because they were made on very small budgets. Nevertheless, Sony tasked them with making an Oblivion killer. Now, as we all know, making a game with the sole intention of competing with another, very hyped up game is usually a death sentence. See the slew of Halo killers in the early 2000s if you don't believe me. Ugh. But with the hope of a big break on their hands, From Software started work on their Oblivion-killing follow-up to Kingsfield. Things started off terribly from basically the very beginning. Within the first year of development, the game was already considered a failure internally. Demon Souls wasn't doing well. The project had problems, and the team had been unable to create a compelling prototype, said Armored Core director Hidetaka Miyazaki in an interview with The Guardian. However, with this complete dismissal by both From Software and Sony, Miyazaki saw an opportunity. Transferring from working on the Armored Core series, he stepped in to try and salvage the project after the original game director got transferred to a different internal project. Miyazaki saw this as his opportunity to finally make a game completely in his own vision. Quote, "I could turn it into anything I wanted. Best of all, if my ideas failed, nobody would care. It was already a failure." With this mindset firmly in place, he reworked the game from the ground up, switching the perspective from first to third person, and essentially scrubbing away any traces of Elder Scrolls influence, seeking to make something completely new. The internal view of the project being doomed to failure or cancellation helped with this freedom. But so too did this cool trick Miyazaki figured out, lying to his bosses. In progress reports to Sony, he was intentionally vague about what the game actually was, and fully hid certain details, such as the high level of difficulty, rightly believing that Sony would most likely have outright cancelled the game had they known. Now, just as if he was making a blue blood sword build, Miyazaki must have put all his points into luck, because the one person he was forced to share his true vision of the game with, his direct producer at Sony, was actually fully on board with his ideas and agreed that maybe the money people upstairs didn't have to know about all the features and ideas Miyazaki was experimenting with in Demon's Souls. Unfortunately, however, when they first debuted this new and reimagined Demon's Souls as a demo to the public at the Tokyo Game Show 2008, in the words of game producer Takeshi Kaiji, it was nothing short of a disaster. The people who played the game absolutely hated it, with some giving up before even completing the character creation. Gamers and publications just didn't know what to make of this bizarre game, and it's funny to see how they struggle to make sense of it, with GameSpot describing it as somewhere between Devil May Cry and Diablo. Amazingly, despite all this, the game was still not cancelled, with Miyazaki's high luck stat coming through once again, as From Software was concurrently developing a game which Sony saw as a much safer bet called Ninja Blade. Sony was willing to accept the weird fantasy RPG passion project from one of FromSoft's game directors. However, just prior to the release, From Software showed a nearly complete build to former Sony International president Shuhei Yoshida, who said of it, quote, "This is crap. This is an unbelievably bad game." And Sony changed their mind on an international release, limiting Demon's Souls to a Japan-only release in an attempt to save some money on what they viewed as an inevitable failure. Upon its initial Japanese release in February 2009, Demon's Souls wildly underperformed, even by the low standards set for it, selling less than 20,000 copies in its first week. However, for the few that did actually give its dark world and challenging difficulty the time needed, there is a positive word-of-mouth sentiment among its players. Seeing this, Sony decided to offer the international distribution rights to Atlus and Bandai Namco for North America and Europe in the hope they might be able to recoup some of their lost budget on the project. Now, due to some North American players previously importing the Japanese version of the game, there was already an underground hype for it. People had heard rumor of an incredibly difficult and strange RPG from Japan that seemed to mock its players for even trying to beat its cast of otherworldly horrors, but which rewarded players with an incredible sense of accomplishment gained from besting its hardest challenges and the darkly beautiful world full of mysterious lore tying it all together. Thanks to this, upon its North American and European release in October of the same year, the game would go on to sell over 100,000 copies. Now, as a massive fan of the Souls series myself, with the original Dark Souls being my favorite game of all time, I was honestly kind of amazed I had never played this game before making this video, and I'd bet that there are some of you out there in the same boat. And if you are just interested in hearing what I thought of it, it's good, you should play it. But if you want to know more, and want to know why I spent so much time discussing metal arms at the start of this video, then follow me, my friends, on this journey into the colorless fog of Boletaria. I have actually owned a physical copy of Demon's Souls since 2016, but having just completed both Dark Souls 1 and 2 for the first time back to back, I bought Demon's Souls as I just craved more of the series' particular brand of dark fantasy and challenging combat. However, I bounced off it due to the lack of polish before beating the second area, and with Dark Souls 3 releasing only a few months later, it just got put on the back burner as another game I'd finish one day, but I never actually went back to. Hey. Wait, no, stay back, please. Oh. However, after playing through Uncharted for my last video, I got curious to play some more PS3 classics, and this was the next obvious one. So, I once again booted up RPCS3 and got started. Upon starting the game, you're greeted with possibly one of the best opening cutscenes for any game. gotta say that I love the art style on display here. It just feels so unique, even compared to the other FromSoft games. Instead of the epic gothic fantasy from the Souls series, we have a more grounded Romanesque style, where things are chunkier, blockier, and more utilitarian compared to the highly ornate stuff you see in Dark Souls. And I think that's awesome. In the Souls games, you're always some form of chosen one, but in Demon Souls, you're just another adventurer, and the game really helps reinforce that with its far more subdued and utilitarian style. You feel so much more like an average person thrust into this fantastical world than someone destined to save it, and so you spend a lot more time moving through back alleys and caves rather than exploring the rooftops of cathedrals or walking the paths of the gods. I also like how this world feels far more like it's in the process of going to shit, rather than having been destroyed before you ever entered it, like it does in the Souls games. There's a more lived-in quality to these levels, and you can sometimes still see the inhabitants going about their jobs, or see towns and villages in the distance, so it's much easier to imagine how life would have worked in Boletaria than it is in any of the other Souls games. Knowing the history of this game's development, I find it very interesting to look at its design. King's Field was always firmly in the dungeon crawler subgenre of RPGs. It's not a genre we see much of anymore, as much like classic adventure games, they were full of needlessly cryptic puzzles, trial and error gameplay where unavoidable traps and knowledge checks were common, and they showed a seeming dislike for the player, often appearing to revel in tricking and delaying you at every turn. However, what King's Field did do well was the feeling of adventure. The games were often open-ended, with a focus on finding secrets and exploring their interconnected maze-like levels. While combat existed in those games, it was never the focus, as often you had to basically cheese every enemy you came across, abusing the slow turn speed to circle strafe them while just spamming attacks. Sounds familiar, eh? So, I find it interesting to see how Demon Souls was so clearly influenced by the King's Field games in a much more direct way than the rest of the Souls series, and you can definitely tell it was originally supposed to be a King's Field game. Demon Souls is a much larger focus on exploration, with levels full of far more secrets and optional areas than any of the other Souls games. And while it certainly has a lot of enemies, they often feel more like obstacles to drain your resources compared to the future entries, where combat becomes more and more of a focus of the game. This does, however, have the negative effect of making combat very one-note in this game, as enemies usually only have 1 to 2 attacks and just run at you swinging wildly as their main strategy. There are very few genuinely interesting combat scenarios in any of the levels. Combat also has a weird flow to it, as levels are often painfully cramped, causing swings to bounce off walls and ceilings, and while there is a push mechanic to try and make space in these cramped environments, due to it not interrupting even basic enemy attacks, it rarely ever felt useful. Your moveset is made even stranger by the fact that sprinting and rolling attacks do noticeably more damage than anything else, often requiring you to back away from an enemy to make space just to start sprinting or rolling back at them again to access your best damage. Combat is made even more awkward by how weird lock-on feels in this game, where it shoves your camera down and while you're locked on you can only roll in 4 directions, whereas when you're unlocked you can roll in any direction you choose, which makes dodging feel way easier. However, as I said, I feel that the combat stiffness is more of a product of them going for that dungeon crawler feel than anything else. Because as I mentioned earlier, combat in King's Field, and most dungeon crawlers, was often nothing more than simply mashing attack, with combat meant more to drain your resources than to be an actual challenge and focus by itself. This dungeon crawler feel is also heightened by the amount of environmental interaction in this game. There are tons of barrels to blow up, traps to activate, and environmental hazards to avoid. This does help spice up combat in some of these areas, as it's much more fun to lure enemies into traps or bait them into blowing themselves up rather than engaging in a straight up fight. Speaking of environments, this is something I really do want to praise, because the level design on display is simply fantastic, except for one noticeable exception. The levels have a very solid flow to them, and while they always have a clear goal, there is almost always multiple ways to progress, or multiple paths to get to the same location. For example, don't like getting fried by the dragon while trying to cross this bridge? Try going through the aqueduct below it. But it's not just a way to bypass the dragon, as the aqueduct is full of more challenging enemies and in higher numbers. So simply sprinting across the bridge between the gaps in Dragonfire is a totally legitimate option too. The levels also do a great job of creating that interconnected maze-like feel that people praise in Dark Souls so much. But arguably, it's even better here, due to the fact that this game's equivalent of bonfires just sends you back to the hub rather than having any utility in the level itself, means they're much rarer, often with only 1 or 2 per area. This caused the level designers to be much more creative with how the level flows, rather than the almost comically frequent bonfires of later entries. The levels often twist back on themselves and follow a much more vertical structure, allowing multiple shortcuts to be opened to the same archstone, so that a single archstone can service an entire area. And just speaking from personal preference here, I think it's even more comforting feeling to find a shortcut back to an existing checkpoint than to simply find more new ones. This, I imagine, was also influenced by Kingsfield, as in those games, you would commonly be able to see a future area that you would only reach much later on in your playthrough. This feeling is often echoed in Demon's Souls, whether it's seeing catwalks above you that you will eventually reach, or a giant pit that you will eventually find yourself at the bottom of. However, the fantastic level design does make me really disappointed that the levels themselves are completely separate from each other, forcing you back to the hub to teleport to a new area every time you finish one. Imagine what it would have been like if you had each one of these individual levels connecting in ways that are just as clever as all the little connections and shortcuts within them. On the topic of disappointment, however, I must mention that one noticeable exception. The ironically named Prison of Hope is a really annoying level, and while it certainly has some of the aspects, with lots of shortcuts and a very vertical layout, it has the issue of every floor of the prison looking identical, making it very easy to get lost, even if you're paying attention. And the structure of it, where you keep backtracking between different floors as you keep finding more keys, just makes it worse, with the highlight being the Vine Boom Iron Maidens, which did make me laugh every time. But the fact that I only have a single level that I had issue with shows just how carefully crafted the rest of them are. I did find some very strange flaws when it comes to the exploration though. First off, despite there being so many secret and optional areas, barely any of them contain any worthwhile loot. Most likely due to the rushed development, there just aren't that many weapons to find, and there's barely any armor sets whatsoever. So I spent the majority of my playthrough wearing varying amounts of my starting armor, due to me neither finding any or it being locked to my character's gender, which is a bizarre choice that luckily was never brought back in future games, as it functions to do nothing but lock you out of certain armor sets while providing no other gameplay benefits. One other complaint about the loot is how difficult it is to upgrade a weapon. The higher end upgrade materials are insanely rare, with me never actually finding any of the stones needed to max out my weapon of choice, which is just crazy when boss weapons don't need to be upgraded at all and just arrive maxed out. That has the knock-on effect of making finding new weapons way less exciting too, as I would have liked to experiment with more weapons. But due to how rare finding the right upgrade materials was, I never really branched out because it didn't seem worth it to spend what might be my only chance at upgrading a weapon that playthrough on something that might just suck. Furthermore, this loot system is crippled by the absolutely awful item weight system. Sadly, another holdover from the dungeon crawler genre. Every item you pick up has a weight, not just the items you equip, but every single thing you carry in your inventory. This is not necessarily the worst idea, as it's meant to make you plan ahead and only carry the things into a level you might actually need, rather than lugging around an entire Ren Fair in your back pocket just in case you might need it. However, in practice, this just means that you can easily become overburdened while exploring a level. Due to the enemies respawning every time you go back to the Nexus, and how incredibly rare Archstone fragments are, which are this game's equivalent of Homeward Bones, you are either forced to walk all the way back through the level just to drop off your junk in the Nexus so you can go back and carry more, but then you fight through the entire level again just to get back to where you were, only to find out that item you tried to pick up despawned, because when you tried to pick it up, even though it can't go into your inventory, it gets flagged from being an environmental item to being an item you dropped, which despawns when you reload a level. This meant that multiple times, I ended up getting rid of stuff that I might have wanted to keep because, sure, the Great Axe sounds cool, but if I carry it, then I can't fit these rocks in my pocket to make my sword better. It's just a bizarrely antithetical system to have a game that encourages exploration but then punishes you for doing it too much. Even the remake, which is extremely faithful in most other regards, lets you send items back to the Nexus when you become overburdened. So sadly, despite the great level design that made exploring so fun, it could just as often become very frustrating due to the conflicting design ideas. Also, it's a small thing, but it's just so baffling to me that you can't see status effect buildup. So you just stand in poison for a while and then boom, you're poisoned. No warning or indication that it's building up, and no way to tell how long it's going to last for. It's not a huge deal, it just feels so weird that no one thought to add those features in. Each area is punctuated with a boss fight, and while FromSoft may be seen as the kings of boss design now, they certainly did not start off like that. Once again, taking inspiration from dungeon crawlers, the bosses in Demon's Souls are almost entirely puzzle bosses, where fighting them straight up is either not possible or not optimal, and instead you have to figure out some other gimmick to beat them, be it a specific weak point or a specific type of damage. While sometimes this works well, such as the Tower Knight, more often it just sucks, leaving a lot of bosses to feel like an anticlimactic chore rather than a true test of your skill. Bosses like the Dragon God, the Armor Spider, or the Fool's Idol are real low points in the game, as they range from tedious to genuinely unpleasant to fight. Sadly, even the non-puzzle bosses don't fare much better, because despite all of them having their own unique gimmicks, they usually don't put up near enough of a fight for those gimmicks to even matter. There are multiple bosses which had really interesting ideas, such as the old hero being blind and chasing you around based on sound, or the dirty Colossus hitting you with swarms of flies you have to run into the fire to burn off of yourself. However, I literally had no clue about any of these, because even on my first playthrough, I was able to just plow through them without them getting any chance to show off these really interesting ideas the devs had come up with. One thing that all the bosses do excel at is their visual design. I love how bizarre and otherworldly the demons are. They feel almost eldritch in how they never follow any recognizable monster archetypes. And while sure, some of them seem kind of recognizable, like the Big Spider or Man, you also have bosses like this, or like this, where they channel that Lovecraftian feeling of being something beyond our comprehension. It means that despite most of the fights being pretty forgettable from a gameplay perspective, with Old King Allant and the Armor Spider being the only ones I actually died to even once, there are more that I will never forget simply due to their designs and arenas, like the majestic awe of the Storm King or the terrifying scale of the Dragon God. My personal favorite has to be the final level itself, and spoilers here if you haven't played it, but the reveal of the Old One manages to actually live up to the hype of seeing a god. Its strange, otherworldly appearance, combined with the obvious elements of nature, give it this fascinating dichotomy of seeming both alien and natural at the same time. And this area with the never-ending sand dunes and the flocks of birds circling the Old One create a suitably epic feeling for this final confrontation. However, despite my fondness for the design in this game, it does have a number of technical issues that really hold it back. And especially for a PS3 game that came out 3 years after the console's launch, it has some poor graphics, even for the time. Compare it to Uncharted 2 or Arkham Asylum, that both came out in the same year, and you can really see how outdated it was, even then. It's a shame, because the ambition is clearly there, with the Valley of Defilement being truly the most disgusting and depressing swamp in the whole series, with the constant downpour being a unique look that hasn't really shown up in any of the games since, or biblically accurate Jesus in the Prison of Hope, or the simply gorgeous Tower of Latria. It really shows where the ambition was at. Unfortunately, the low polygon counts, the blurry and obviously tiled textures, combined with poor lighting and an over-reliance on post-processing, means that most of these levels only look good from afar, and a lot of them can just descend into blank, featureless hallways, which makes a lot of them drag way more than they should. Another technical failing that can really take away from the experience is the audio. My god, the audio in this game is atrocious. The sound effects are incredibly compressed, giving them that crunchy sound, and the mixing on them is really bad, with some effects like explosions or certain bosses being painfully loud. But but then other things like your footsteps and soul form being completely silent, which just makes the audio landscape of this game feel really weird and unfinished. Some moments, like the final fight with Old King Alant, are completely ruined by this, with the dragon outside the castle just screaming during the whole fight and totally ruining what should be the epic showdown with the final boss. Sadly, the servers for this game were shut down years ago, so I can't speak on it too much, but this game's use of asynchronous multiplayer is still one of the best I've ever seen, as messages and player ghosts are such a cool way to make a world feel alive, and invasions are still one of the most fun forms of multiplayer ever devised. Also, the old monk boss originally summoning in an online player to fight you as the area's boss is just such an awesome idea that I'd love to see in other games. Luckily, these features and so many more were expanded on in the rest of the games. Honestly, I was shocked to see just how much of the Souls blueprint was there right from the first game, with Dark Souls 1 being more accurately Demon Souls 2. And I guess that's my point here. You've all heard of a diamond in the rough, but Demon Souls is a rough diamond. It has all the brilliant ideas of the masterpiece that Dark Souls would become, but the execution just wasn't there yet, with too many rough edges to get the same acclaim the rest of the series got. But isn't it amazing that despite all the hell the development went through, they got that second chance? The chance to take their unique and strange idea and polish it into something that's shine can still be seen in games released nearly 15 years later. All that brings us back to Metal Arms. Yeah, baby, just when you least expect it, it's back. If you remember at the start of this video, I told you the story of a development cycle that was the complete opposite of Demon Souls. A small team trying to start a studio with only enough money for the next month, desperately trying to sell their idea to the industry. Finding a publisher who not only believed in the project, but had the personal backing of the head of the company, and something that was loved by the public when it was shown at E3. Well, I didn't tell you all of that story. While Sierra might have loved the game, their parent company Vivendi did not. They didn't see what everyone else saw in this plucky studio of passionate devs, and tried to pretend it simply didn't exist, giving it no marketing and only a single kiosk in their massive E3 display. So they were shocked when the survey results came back and Metal Arms was the #1 upcoming release by audience interest. They quickly scraped together a marketing push for the game, but it was too little, too late. The game would launch to strong critical reviews, but barely any sales, selling an estimated 60,000 units in its opening week across 3 entire consoles. Despite pitching the game as the first in a trilogy, and already having the green light on a sequel, it got cancelled a mere 2 weeks into development. Vivendi then got bought by Blizzard Entertainment, and not long after, Swinging Ape Studios were pushed into becoming a support team for the in-development StarCraft spin-off, StarCraft Ghosts. But after that game too was cancelled in 2006, Swinging Ape got shut down entirely, with the remaining staff either quitting, getting let go, or simply swallowed into the rest of Blizzard to assist development on their more popular series. Steve Rank, one of the founding members of Swinging Ape, has since said in interviews that he tried to buy the rights to Metal Arms back multiple times, but for whatever reason, Blizzard refused to part with them. And when Blizzard was purchased by Activision, the IP was swallowed up into the black hole of forgotten IP owned by massive companies destined never to see the light of day again. Stories like this make me so sad, because you can look at Demon Souls, and despite all its flaws and all it went through, it got that sequel, and it went on to become one of the most successful and influential game series of all time. While I'm not going to say that Metal Arms could have been anywhere near as influential or important as the Souls series, I think that it had so many unique ideas, and so much love poured into it, that a sequel could have created an all-time classic that would still be talked about today. If they were able to smooth out its rough edges and poor boss fights and floaty controls, while further expanding the great ideas like enemy possession and limb-based destruction, it could have been something truly remarkable. It's not alone, however. There are so many titles like Bulletstorm, both versions of Prey, Vanquish, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Phantom Dust, or I, All incredibly unique titles with amazing ideas that never got the chance to be refined into their full potential. I wish the games that got sequels weren't just the massive titles that sold millions, but the weird, the experimental, and sometimes the not even that good ones that could have been something amazing. Whew, man, this video was hell to get finished. This is the first time I tried writing on a game that I hadn't played before I actually made the video, so that was interesting. It certainly took a bit longer because I didn't go in with the idea of how I wanted to tackle it. I had to go through it and then afterwards figure out what exactly I wanted to say about it, because I certainly did want to say something about it, because Demon's Souls is a very interesting game, especially nowadays, but it was hard at the time to figure out exactly what it was that really gave it that feeling that made me so interested in it. Also, I've had so many just life things come up between terrible sickness and construction and just everything conspiring to make sure this video did not get finished. So sorry if I sound a little weird at parts in this video. I recorded different bits of it anytime I was feeling well enough to actually talk, you know? So hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully it won't take so darn long to make the next one. So with that, I bid you adieu and hope that I'll see you next time.